This is a quick video explaining one of the more complicated parts of chapter 1. So it's in section 1.2.3 in chapter 1, and it's the stuff on necessary and sufficient conditions. So necessary and sufficient conditions come into play typically when we're dealing with what are called conditional sentences. You're going to see this more in chapter 3. But for now, the typical form of conditional sentence that you're dealing with here is what's called a material conditional. And material conditional sentences are typically written in the form of a if-then sentence. Sorry, I want a pen. There you go. So when you have an if-then sentence, that's typically introducing a representative of a material conditional. And an not easy, but a pretty straightforward example is if, I want black, if it's raining, then I'll wear boots. So when you have an if by itself, like you do right here, what comes immediately after the if is called the antecedent. Then if is often paired with then, not always, but often. If you have an if then, what comes after the then is called the consequent. And if I were to write this in like symbolic logic, it would be written like this. If it's raining, then, that's the symbol for the if-then statement, I'll wear boots. So what comes before that arrow is called the antecedent. What comes after the arrow is called the consequent. When we look at it in the form of language, if by itself introduces the antecedent, and the then, which is where like the arrow would go kind of, introduces the consequent. But there's a catch. If I have a sentence that says, I need space, I'll wear boots only if it's raining, this is different. Only if is not if. When you have only if, what you're saying is, okay, what I'm saying is I'll wear boots only if it's raining. I'm saying that it's gotta be raining for me to wear boots. Like I'm not gonna wear them because it's stylish or anything like that. Whereas up here, when I'm saying if it's raining, then I'll wear boots, I'm not precluding the possibility that I might wear my boots because they're like super hip. Right? But down here, I'm saying the only condition under which I'll wear boots is the condition of rain. And we'll talk about this in terms of necessary and sufficient in a second. So if you see only if, remember that what comes after the only if is the consequent. What comes before the only if is the antecedent. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, dude, fine, it's the same order. But here's the trick. If I write this sentence like this, I'll wear boots if it's raining. So these are all three different sentences. But in this case, I've got the if in the middle of the sentence, right? So in this case, what comes after the if, because it's just if by itself, is the antecedent. And in that case, what comes before the if is the consequent. So the big takeaway is that whatever comes immediately after an if by itself is an antecedent. And whether that if happens in the middle of the sentence, as it does in this example, or at the start of the sentence, as it does up here, whatever comes immediately after the if is the antecedent. That's different when it comes to only if. When you have only if, you basically keep things in the same order. So what comes before the only if is the antecedent, and what comes after the only if is the consequent. Now, what does that have to do with necessary and sufficient conditions? Typically, when you have an if-then statement and it's written in the normal part, the thing that comes right after the if, the antecedent, is often the sufficient condition. And the thing that comes after the then is often the necessary condition. So another way to think about that is that in English, if introduces a sufficient condition, and a sufficient condition is one that guarantees that something else will happen. So if I say, what's a good example? If I say, you'll pass the class if you turn in all the homework. So you'll pass if you turn in all the homework. Homework, there we go. What I'm saying is turning in the homework is a sufficient condition for passing the class. Because we remember, if we write this sentence in the kind of standard if-then form, given that we have if by itself here, what we end up with is if you turn in all the homework, then you'll pass the class. So turning in all the homework, in this case, is both the antecedent of the sentence and it's a sufficient condition for obtaining the goal. Turning in all the homework is sufficient for passing the class. But when I think of a necessary condition, only if, the word only if, often introduces what's called a necessary condition. And a necessary condition is something that must hold in order for something else to obtain, but in and of itself is not sufficient. It's not the whole thing that has to happen. So if I have a grading policy that says you'll pass the class only if you turn in all, I'll just put homework like that. Now what I'm saying when I have only if is turning in all the homework is a necessary condition for passing the class, but it's not sufficient, right? Because in order to, if I say you'll pass the class only if you turn in all the homework, well, one, maybe you also have to get all the homework right. And two, maybe the homework is only worth like 40% of your grade. So merely turning in all the homework, even if you get it all right, is not sufficient to pass the class because there's still another 60% of your grade left. So you'll pass the class only if you turn in the homework shows that this, which is both the consequent of the material conditional and the necessary condition, is not sufficient. This is the sufficient condition. Because what this says is that if you've passed the class, then you must have turned in all the homework, right? Because passing the class actually guarantees you've turned in all the homework. But turning in all the homework doesn't guarantee that you've passed the class. It's pretty complicated. Let me rephrase that. It's not actually a complicated concept once you find an example that clicks in your head. And so if some of the examples from the book help, or if this, because you often have grading policies that are similar to this, these might be familiar to you. Something like that, just try and find an example that helps it click in your head. Now, if we turn to these examples or the questions from the book. So in the first one, I think it's pretty straightforward because here we have the word if, here we have the word then. So what comes after the if? This is the antecedent. What comes after the then? This is the consequent. The sufficient condition is that the car is running, and the necessary condition is that there's gas in the car, because the car isn't going to run on empty. So gasoline in the tank is necessary, right? If the car is running, then there has to be gasoline in the tank. Namely, gasoline is necessary for the car to run. Conversely, if we know that the car is running is sufficient to indicate to us that there must be gasoline in the tank. So A, B, and C all in the same order, but if we look at D, in D we have if by itself in the middle of the sentence. So in this case, the antecedent, which comes immediately after the if, is here. Sally goes to the movies. The consequent, which in this case would come before the if, is that she'll see a comedy. And the sufficient condition is that Sally goes to the movies. And the necessary condition is that she'll see a comedy. And that's because in this case, her going to the movies is sufficient to guarantee that she's seen a comedy. Conversely, her seeing a comedy indicates that she must have seen a movie. This is actually a little trickier example. If we look at number E, this is the only if problem. So in this one, remember, when you have only if in the middle of a sentence, what comes after the only if is the consequent, and what comes before the only if is the antecedent. So Sally will see a comedy only if she goes to the movies. In this case, the necessary condition is back here, and the sufficient condition is up here. So try working through some of these. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact her, but it's really important to get this idea of necessity and sufficiency stuck in your mind, because for understanding a lot of the ways arguments work, having that relationship with if-then statements is really important, because we often express ourselves in terms of if-then statements. So again, if you have any questions, send me an email.